Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Gabriella Huffman here to help you study for your North Carolina real estate exam. We are still breaking down chapter 7, and we are on video 3 of 5. Chapter 7 in your book is labeled the real estate brokerage and law of agency. So in this video series, we're going to talk about buyer agents, seller agents, sub-agents, dual agents, and designated dual agency. So from here on out, do make a note, write this down. Buyer agents are also called selling agents. They're the ones selling the house because they're bringing the buyer. So buyer agents are called selling agents. The little snippet at the bottom is from the previous video series, just to remind you that the agent works for the client, meaning you owe the client old car. And with the customer, you owe the customer honesty, fairness, and disclosure of material facts. So as a buyer's agent, there's 3 ways to work with buyers or work for buyers: old car, oral agreements, exclusive written agreements, and non-exclusive written agreements. But for test purposes, we're going to focus on oral buyer agreements. So when you have an oral agreement with a buyer, you do represent the buyer. So you owe that buyer old car. As you probably know, when it comes time to writing an offer, you must reduce that oral buyer agency to writing. You cannot continue to work with a buyer under contract with an oral agreement. You are not allowed to submit an offer for a buyer with an oral buyer agency agreement. So if you have an oral buyer agency agreement with a buyer and it's time to write an offer and the buyer says, I don't want to sign an agreement with you, then you can no longer work for them. Buyers that have oral agreements with agents can work with as many other oral agreement agents as they want, because oral buyer agency is non-exclusive. So a buyer can work with as many other agents as they'd like, as long as they are also non-exclusive or oral buyer agency. There is no expiration on this. There's nothing in writing. So you can't bind that buyer to work with you for a certain amount of time with an oral buyer, nor can you tell them that they have to just work with you under oral buyer, because there's nothing in writing to do that. You cannot limit them. Seller agencies, so we're going to talk about listing agents. Listing agents are also called sellers agents. Notice the possession there. And sub agents. Sub agency is called seller sub agents. So all sub agents represent the seller. There's no such thing as buyer sub agency, so you don't have to worry about that. So from here on out, when you see the term sub agent, think listing agent. So here's an example. The listing is with the firm who's the agent, and the listing agent is who's going to facilitate that listing, who's the sub-agent. So just like a submarine is underwater, the listing agent is the sub-agent who's under the agent or firm who has the listing agreement with the seller. So seller sub-agency, you represent the seller. They're just listing agents. So when you have a listing agreement with a seller, the other agents of that same firm also become seller sub-agents. And if you remember from the past video series, should that listing agent pass away, that listing agreement does not terminate because the listing agreement is with the firm. So the firm is just going to appoint another agent of that same firm, because all agents are sub-agents to that seller client. So you may start off as a buyer's agent under an oral agreement, for example. And remember, you cannot continue to work with that buyer under an oral agreement when it comes time to presenting an offer. So if that buyer says, no, I don't want to sign a buyer's agreement with you, you can no longer work with them as a buyer's agent. So you may want to try and achieve seller sub-agency. So it doesn't automatically happen when that buyer declines signing that written agreement, but you can get permission to go from a buyer's agent to a seller sub-agent, now representing the seller. So therefore, that agent, sub-agent, can work with the buyer, meaning owing the buyer honesty, fairness, and disclosure of material facts. So remember, an agent works for the client, that's who you owe old car to, and with the customer, that's who you owe honesty, fairness, and disclosure of material facts. Dual agency. So there's three types of dual agency, and in all three scenarios, I want you to remember that there's only one firm. The word dual has to do with that one firm representing both the buyer and the seller at the same time in the same transaction. So what this means is the firm has a buyer's agreement in place and the firm has a listing agreement in place with the seller. So this buyer is trying to buy the seller's house. So one firm duly represents the buyer and seller for the same property in the same transaction. So here are the three types of dual agency, where you may have one agent who represents the seller and the buyer, but notice it's the firm has both the buyer-seller agreements in place. You may have two agents of the same firm representing the buyer and seller. So here's where it gets a little tricky. It's still dual. Even though there's two agents here, it's still dual agency. So what that means is there's no customers. There are only clients here. So agent number one has to provide old car to the seller and old car to the buyer. Agent number two has to provide old car to the buyer and old car to the seller. So visually, it looks like each party has their own agent, but that's not necessarily what's going on here because it's still dual agency. No customers, only clients. There's no cooperating firms, meaning two different firms. It's all under one roof. So remember in the past video series, anything you learn about the customer, you must tell your client. That does not apply here. There are no customers. So if agent one were to find out about the buyer's motivation to buy, agent one can't tell the seller because technically he's got to be fair to both. He owes old car to both. You cannot favor one over the other in dual agency. The third type of dual agency is when you have two different locations, but it's owned by the same person, if that helps. They just may have a Wilmington location and a Hampstead location. So it's still dual, no customers, only clients here. So dual agency, you can share confidential information about the buyer and seller with other brokers of the same firm because there's no customers. So going back to seller sub, when you have a listing agreement with a seller, you are a seller sub agent, and all the agents at your firm are also seller sub agents. When you have a dual agency scenario, all agents are dual agents at the same firm. So we can share price, term, motivation with other agents of the same firm because nothing's going to go past that roundtable discussion. There are no customers. We cannot lawfully tell the buyer or seller what we heard. Everything's going to stay between the brokers of that firm. So no confidential information can be shared to the buyer or seller. There are no customers here. There are only clients. Everything stays within the house. So in this case, yes, a provisional broker and a BIC can practice dual agency with each other. So if the provisional broker has the buyer and the BIC has the seller, this is allowed because everything's going to stay between the provisional broker and the BIC. The provisional broker, yes, is directly supervised by the BIC. So the BIC's going to see the PB's files. The BIC's probably going to find out about the PB's client's motivation, but that's okay because in dual agency, it stays right there. It doesn't go past that table conversation. So provisional brokers and BICs can practice dual agency. So again, all we have here are clients, or what we know now are principals. So you have to owe old car to both. There are no customers. Agents have to be neutral and impartial. So think of this dual agent, whether there's one agent or two agents, they're referees. Okay, just like in a football game, you have several refs on a field. They don't favor one side or the other. They're just making sure that the game is playing fairly. And that's exactly what you're doing in dual agency. So you cannot disclose confidential information to the buyer or to the seller. There are no customers. So everything you find out must stay with you. Obviously, you're going to have consent from the buyer and seller to practice this. They have to understand that this is a game of referee, not advocacy, which we'll talk about as well. So off to the right, I have a checklist of the different types of agents that can practice dual agency. So I highlighted that, yes, a provisional broker and a BIC can be dual to each other. Here's a great example, right? Agent one may be the BIC having the listing. Agent two may be the provisional broker having the buyer. Yes, this is okay because anything that's discussed between the BIC and the PB stay between the BIC and the PB. It cannot be told to the buyer seller because there are no customers. Okay. So in dual agency, client advocacy is essentially lost. All right. You cannot favor one over the other. You are simply a referee. So designated dual agency is an optional form of dual. But keep in mind, you can't practice designated without the dual. It's just another level here. So when you have designated dual agency, that word designated brings back the customer. Okay, so now we have customers, now we have clients. So going back to what we learned before, anything you learn about the customer, you must tell the client. And anything that you know about your client stays with you. You cannot disclose that without their consent. Okay, so again, a broker works for the client, old car, and with the customer. So that one word designated brings us back to that customer client situation. So each agent has a customer client. Okay, so these are the scenarios from before. Agent one owes old car to the seller. Okay, agent one only represents the seller. Agent two owes old car to the buyer and only represents the buyer. So if either agent finds out about the other side, the enemy's motivation, price, terms, whatever it may be, they must tell their client. Okay, so this is why provisional brokers and BICs cannot practice designated dual agency. It's not fair because a PB is directly supervised by the BIC. So the BIC's going to learn about the other side's motivation. This can't happen then because technically they would have to tell their clients. So provisional brokers and BICs cannot practice designated dual agency, and neither can sole practitioners. You can't have one agent designated to the buyer and seller. It doesn't work like that. So on your test, they're going to ask you which of dual agency gives you fuller, better representation, which one does the advocacy return, and that would be designated dual agency. Okay, so same visual setup, but notice that one word changes how information is handled.